Hello, and welcome to the Aurora Podcast, where we discuss topics that are used to advance our understanding and reasoning about today's world. We're here at the Walker Museum, where their goal is to advance kind of the curiosity surrounding our cultural and historical landscape. And I'm joined with Owen, and today we will be interviewing Akshay.
Thank you so much, Ben and Owen, for having me. I'm really glad to be here. I am Akshay. My name translates to infinite sunshine in Sanskrit. So big shout out to my parents for coming up with something clever there. And I'm a 25-year-old designer. I currently reside in San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to Stanford for college, which is sort of my mutual connection to Ben, and really excited to see where our conversation goes today.
Sweet. So I think my first question would be kind of what got you into product design as a major?
Yeah. Growing up, my dream job was to become an architect. So I actually grew up in the Midwest. I was born in Cleveland, but I was raised in Kansas. And my entire time in college, I got a lot of jokes about people asking if I had a dog named Toto or if I had a little cellar in my backyard I would go in when there were tornadoes. But I had to put up with all of those Wizard of Oz jokes. But I really did treasure my childhood in Kansas. I think Kansas is a place where it's great to start a family because it's a state where ideas flow really slowly in and out of the state. And so it's an interesting little like silo or a little space bubble right in the middle of the United States where you can sort of still have a happy childhood. It isn't run over by, people talking about billion-dollar companies and the future of tech. It's a place where you can really go play outside after school, and people genuinely enjoy talking about the weather. And I think I really enjoyed having a little bit of a slower paced childhood. But in the process, I fell in love with architecture. I used to get in trouble in middle school and high school in parent-teacher conferences where the teachers would call me out for not taking notes in class and instead just drawing blueprints on graph paper. It was my very first love, and I loved architecture for I think two or three reasons. One is you have to satisfy the needs and wants of someone. I'll have a client who will come to you and be like, I want a beautiful backyard with a floor to ceiling living room window. And I think I was really fascinated by sort of solving human problems as opposed to like technology problems. The second thing was you have to make the most of a limited set of materials. I think creativity has always been something I take great pride in as sort of a self-defined strength. And constraints really is what breeds creativity in the world. And so the idea of like having to make the most of a limited set of resources is really fascinating to me. And lastly, when you design a house or a building for anyone, you're not just designing it for the people who are about to move in there. You actually have to think in mind, what is this building going to look like in 50 years from now, 100 years from now? Who might be future families that move in? So sort of designing or building something to last is almost like what I like to call like a cultural artifact of a generation, in the same way when we think back to our childhoods and we think of our first Nintendo Wii or our first like Etch-a-Sketch or whatever those like random products from like, the early 2000s. I think a big opportunity as a designer is to create something like that. Sure, maybe you're designing like a new kind of spoon for the kitchen, but make it one that like every single person in the world like might remember nostalgically when they think about their like 20s or 30s and their favorite spoon and their favorite bowl. So I fell in love with architecture, but I sort of stumbled upon this magical major at Stanford called product design, which to me was the architecture of everything. For the first time, I wasn't like limited to skyscrapers and bathrooms. I could apply this exact same three things of like design something for someone's needs and wants, make the most of a specific set of materials and resources, and design like a cultural artifact, to iPhones, to experiences, to weddings, and this sort of like broad appeal of what they call like design thinking at Stanford, or this like particular toolkit for solving problems, really resonated with me. And I realized, wow, it was almost the most freeing and empowering set of like creative tools I had achieved in my life. So since then, I've like tried to apply that skill set in a few different ways, but that's how I kind of got to my major.
Sweet. Yeah. So talking about post-college, you said you've been designing something. So where did you start after college? Where did you start designing products, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, so to date, just for a little bit of context, I've invented or created about 12 different products, I would say, that kind of got beyond like a sort of a prototype or dorm room cardboard form. So I've built and shipped a few things around the world, but I am also really passionate about nonprofit product design. So slightly more context there, both of my parents originally came from a medical background in India. So I've always understood the importance of personal health and sort of body movement and body control and longevity. And so I was always really passionate about prosthetic design. So I invented a lot of different prosthetics when I was in college. My other big influence is I'm a musician, specifically a violinist, and I love playing jazz and pop and R&B, and I actually 3D print some of my own electric violins. And so I think both the musical influence from my childhood as well as the sort of like importance of health and wellness influence combined to shape a lot of the products I've worked on to date. So a few random examples of things I've invented. I already mentioned the 3D printed violins. I've built a few different prosthetics. I built a prosthetic that let people hold a violin bow and control it by flexing their toes. I have invented a music stand that sticks to walls so that you can stick it at any height or use it in a hotel room when you're on the go. And I launched that on Kickstarter my senior year of college and ended up shipping it to 7 different countries around the world and had a lot of fun with that for a couple of years. But all of those, I would say, were really practice runs for what is my first company, which I've been working on for the past 3 years since graduation with the team. And these previous things were products, but my company, Tangible, we've been building a new product experience for long distance couples and families that let them essentially share physical touch in video calls and share hugs and not just feel connected, but actually feel physically present across the world. So we've been working on a product over the past 3 years and we'll be launching it actually in just a few weeks. Yeah.
Awesome. You mentioned you were a violinist. Both of us also play the violin. We've both been playing since we were like 4 or 5
Sweet.
years old. Yeah.
All right. If only we could sight read a trio or something in this.
Yeah, exactly.
You talked about kind of starting in the early stages and not really producing designs until the company that you're just about to launch. But I'm curious, what do those early designs look like, and how do you work through the creative process and move into the final stages of design?
Yeah, there's a lot of thoughts there. I think people overestimate how easy it is or how hard it is to go from 0 to 0.1 of an idea. I think a lot of people like stop at the idea phase itself because they're like, oh, it's just way too hard to even get sort of a minimum viable version of this. People don't realize that when you're building a solution, the first thing you can do is split a solution into 2 types of solution, a looks like solution or a works like solution. If I want to design the next iPhone, I don't really have to get the whole thing to work. I could just literally get a napkin sketch and just draw out whatever it'll look like. And in some cases, if I'm like trying to describe the idea to an investor or to a family member, a sketch really gets the job done. But there's other things where like a work-like prototype is important. If I wanted to build a music stand that sticks to walls, like no amount of sketches I show someone is going to convince someone that it can actually stick to walls. I have to figure out what kind of nanosuction or random, suction cups can like actually make that happen. And people probably care less about the looks like. So the main thing people get paralyzed on when they're starting a new idea is they're trying to do both the works like and the looks like at the same time, rather than sort of breaking it down into one of those things. But then for the people who do actually get there, you typically vastly underestimate the amount of effort that it takes to go from 0.1 to 1. It's taken me 3 years to like raise funding, build a team. It's all the little operational stuff that really slows down an idea. How do you figure out how to like ship a product at the USPS store? How do you like figure out taxes? How do you incorporate your company? It's all like the legal paperwork, and it's like the hundreds and hundreds of red tape things that really slow ideas down from getting to the world. But the actual design process can happen lightning quick if you have like the right ability to sort of break down the big problem into really small versions of works like and looks like prototypes along the way.
Yeah. Sweet. So what was kind of your first invention?
My very first invention, I think, was probably the 3D printed violins. So I had spent a lot of my high school years getting to have really enriching summer experiences in music. I spent 3 years getting to travel around the world as a violinist in National Youth Orchestra of the USA. So I did that for 2 or 3 years, and I was coming off a giant high of like having just gone to 7 cities in China the summer before my freshman year of college. So when I got to college, I was like, oh, I'm an engineering major, not a musician. And all of a sudden, I saw all these friends and other folks I knew who were going to like the best music conservatories in the nation and like doing even more music. And for me, it was like a complete 1-0 of like, okay, the violin now needs to take a side seat. I have to focus on these like physics classes and stuff. And I was really trying to find a way to like bridge the gap between the two. There was an amazing resource at Stanford called the Product Realization Lab. It's sort of like this magical like mini Hogwarts for like the mechanical engineering students at Stanford. And it's this big facility where they have tons of 3D printers and laser cutters and saws and all sorts of crazy machines that like someone who, a kid who grew up in Kansas had never seen before. And I was just like completely awestruck by the amount of tools that were there at my disposal at like a very, cheap perceived kind of fee. I could just sign up for different slots to use that facility and could go there for like 4-hour shifts, like multiple times per week. And so I really got into 3D printing for the first time. And I had a few professors at Stanford who said that 3D printing is the best thing that's ever happened to modern manufacture, and it's also the worst thing that's ever happened to modern manufacturing. The reason it's the best is it completely empowers anyone, even if they don't have much engineering knowledge, to just like take an idea from their brain, stick it in a computer, and like 4 to 6 hours later have a looks like prototype of it in their hands. It's magical. The downside of it is there's now so much tools that can automate that process of designing that product for you that oftentimes you take a lot of shortcuts in the project, or you don't really appreciate the process that people used to go through when they had to hand carve and hand chisel, the design from scratch. And so really getting into 3D printing, I was like, it would be so cool if I could like 3D print a violin. There's actually been a few other folks who had 3D printed a violin before me, but they had always done like a giant, super expensive one-piece violin. And as a violinist, I was really aware of a specific problem. When a lot of beginner violinists choose their instruments for the first time, this is when 4th graders and 5th graders are joining their elementary school string programs. Their parents are oftentimes not musicians. And so the parents will like take the kid to a local string shop where you have to choose your violin for the first time. And it's not as simple as like kind of choosing your Harry Potter magic wand where like the instrument chooses you. It's actually much more nuanced in the sense of the price of an instrument is not always proportional to the quality of an instrument. Most violins that are over, like $1,000, $2,000 are like fairly decent, but that is a lot of money for someone who's starting out in like 4th grade and their parents are like, is this kid even going to be practicing this thing? Like, fine, we'll buy this thing. And they're probably willing to spend, a couple $100 on like the starter instrument. Most couple $100 violins are terrible. And so I knew it was kind of an avant-garde idea to expect like, kids to buy like an electric violin as their first thing. But I was curious, like, how cheap can I design a violin that is actually guaranteed to sound good? And how can I maybe design it almost as a series of Lego bricks that snap together so they can almost have like a customized like look and feel to it? I think for me as a violinist, I love like a particular look of my violin. I prefer like slightly red colored violins over to brown, and I didn't want to like design one fiddle to sort of suit them all. Like wouldn't make like most folks happy. So that was sort of like the prompt of diving into that problem, and I spent about 2 months like designing a lot of 3D printing parts of the violin in my room. And I want to thank my roommate. We did live in a 1-room double that time for putting up with all the whirring and whining of that 3D printer. But yeah, we ended up creating a few different designs, and I then easily just hooked up the electronics in it. And it was super fun, and I used it to film a bunch of music videos later that year. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, Owen's kind of
I'm
in the 3D printer.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I also know that 3D printers fail a lot, and I'm curious how I guess how much of the design process is that failure, and because I know the sweet success after that failure is, and it makes it even better to succeed. I'm curious how much of the process is failure.
Yeah. Couple notes on that. One is right when I bought my first 3D printer freshman year. That was like right at the start of kind of the 3D printer movement. So a lot of 3D printers were still not super good then, and they'd fail all the time. They were extra noisy and kind of slow too. So I was totally failing and ruining prints all the time. But the broader question you have about like what is the significance of failure in the design process? There's a few little like proverbs within the design community I really love. First is they say, always prototype to answer a question. So you never build something just for the sake of like, let me see if I can make this 10% better. You want to almost start it with the prompt of like, which is going to be better? A red colored violin or an orange colored violin, or like a 10% density 3D print or 20%. And so when it fails, rather than feeling like a setback, it actually is an effective way to answer whatever question. So as long as you're doing a good job of setting specific hypotheses and then building the next prototype and then learning along the way, failure is actually one of the best things that can happen. In fact, with my current company, we're building a way more complicated product than a 3D printed violin. It's looks like a neck pillow, but essentially it has like tons of immersive sensors and electronics that theoretically are able to create like hugs and detect squeezes. And in the early stages of building this, there was physical electronics, there's the actual industrial design of the soft goods, there's an app that has to work with everything, so there's Bluetooth involved and like video calling and other connectivity. And we just got really comfortable shipping like half functional versions of this product out to like 85-year-olds and stuff, knowing that like 50% of these prototypes we were sending out were going to fail immediately. But we just almost had this playful attitude of like, let's see how. We even named each prototype. We gave it a specific name. We're like, oh, Brenda failed us today. Oh, David's doing great, surprisingly, So the more fun you kind of have with it. I'm a big believer that it takes at least 50 prototypes or 50 iterations to get to a market-ready version of anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm working on costume right now. I love designing, building costumes.
Awesome.
And I know what you mean, because I started out with a cardboard version, right? That was good for a year. Then I was like, yeah, no, I've got to make it better. So I made it foam, and it looked better. And now I'm going to a 3D printed version, much more refined, and it just looks better, right? And it's more effective. Yeah. So.
Yeah, happy to kind of be slightly more philosophical and like bounce off of that. So thanks for sharing that. I think that sort of the process of going through different iterations from low res to high res yields, I think, two learnings that I found always to be insightful. One is it's good to kind of spend as little money and time as possible on the earliest prototypes, because that allows you to not feel so emotionally attached to them. The moment you spend $1,000, actually 3D printing something and like painting it, then you put it in the wild and like people tell you like, I hate this thing, this is not going to work for me. But now you're like so emotionally attached. You're like, I just cost sunk like so much money into that. I just really want to work with it. And it then becomes so much harder to take a step back and be like, we need to go in a completely different direction. So that's why the magic of like starting with the cardboard is so valuable. The second thing is, when you start to fall in love with the process of like building 50 prototypes to get to something, you start inherently becoming less attached to every single version of it. And you start to realize that the solution is always silly. And so the problem is actually much more meaningful. To make that more clear, Apple spends millions of dollars every year perfecting what is going to be the 3 or 4 different colors of the iPhone that comes out. Think about how silly that is. Think about how much money car companies spend figuring out whether like the headlight should be at a 20-degree angle or 30 angle to look like slightly more sexy to like consumers. And so we as a humanity spend so much money on interior paint colors and like fake succulents and everything. The solution is always silly. But the problem of, let's say for a car, how can you get a person from point A to point B with the least amount of energy and the most amount of safety within like a certain time frame? Like that's a fascinating problem. Similarly, like a 3D printed electric violin is like such a silly object. But what really is it? It's like a magical way to create sound that doesn't cost $400 and makes you cut down like a fancy tree that's like 300 years old. So I think the more you can fall in love with the problem and just acknowledge that the solution will always be silly, but it's the process that's like really fun, allows you to like have much more patience in the design process as well, because great design takes a very long time. Yeah,
that's great. So you mentioned that you were about to launch your company. how is your process of? Are you like the founder of the company, or are you working with people?
Yes, yeah. So I'm founder and the main designer. I'm working with two amazing co-founders who also came from Stanford a couple different years than me on the software and hardware side. But I'm the lead designer for the project, and I'm the one who had to navigate most of the business thinking and the fundraising and sort of the storytelling so far. Yeah.
Did you take any business classes or get a business degree, or did you just kind of do your own research?
The really funny part about this design thinking process I told you about at Stanford is it gives you a guaranteed framework for how to come up with amazing solutions to problems. And you can apply this framework to anything. You can use it literally to design the ultimate wedding or design the perfect iPhone or the perfect Tesla. But there's one flaw in the design thinking process, which at no point in the design thinking process does it ever challenge you to ask the question, is someone willing to pay for this? So it makes you an amazing designer, but it does not train you necessarily how to be a businessman. So that's something I had to learn a lot in my first couple years after college. And to kind of return to my childhood, I think I came from a very like pure-hearted, sort of naive view of the world, where neither of my parents were business people or entrepreneurs. So I was kind of raised in this context of like, look cute, smile, work super hard, work on kind of social good problems, and the world will sort of encourage and reward you for it. And I think then transitioning over to the Bay Area and specifically like Silicon Valley, which is the context in which I spent most of my like kind of Stanford and post college headspace in, operates very differently. It's like, is this idea worth $1 billion? If not, it's not worth funding or pursuing. There's a much more sort of cutthroat, very monetary sort of metric, very capitalist driven of, does this idea can this idea make the world's richest people 10% richer? If not, you need to either make it a nonprofit, a social good B Corp, or like bootstrap it some other way. It's not going to get venture funding. And I used to genuinely think like, oh, VCs are just like really rich people who like sit on little piles of gold that they want to give to the do-gooders of the world. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But thankfully, after I graduated, I had a few parents of friends from college who had actually worked in Silicon Valley for many decades, and they literally sat me in their backyard and they're like, Akshay, today we're going to help you grow a pair of fangs. And I was like, fangs? What? He's like, yes, fangs. You keep thinking that these VCs are your friends. They are not your friends. They are your business partners. And today I'm going to show you the difference. And they, walked me through a lot of famous case studies and actual business paperwork, and, broke down stock and voting and super voting and board of directors. And what do all these the lower abstraction layers of like building a real business look like? So I would say I was such a happy-go-lucky inventor, build whatever was on my latest whim sort of energy in college. But post-college, I felt like I grew up very quickly, very fast as a much more seasoned kind of like business thinker. And the good part of that is it's made me value quality and patience a lot more. And I've gotten a lot better at striking down or saying no to ideas that I'm now able to understand wouldn't ever be viable at scale. The downside of that is it's made me a little bit less of like a happy-go-lucky dreamer. I think there is some like value in being like that spontaneous, oh, I'm just going to sketch this, I'm going to woodwork this, I'm going to build this today. I'm not quite like that anymore, but I'm much more highly intentional with like the one or two things that I'm focusing on at any given time. And I think there's a lot more to like noodle on there, but that's sort of how I've evolved a little bit since college days.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. As a teenager, starting to look into the college and post college, I've been finding, the world is more nuanced, like you said. There's more. Like you go and you learn in college and you learn what you want to do, and then I found you kind of have to then figure it out. It's like I don't know, looking into design as an example. It's not like you just go into the job and you know everything. You have to learn, you have to move through the process, and I'm wondering, what's your way of finding the nuances and working through that as you were getting into the more business side of this job?
Yeah, the most difficult part of running the business is building conviction on a daily basis, especially when you're your own boss. we'll talk about this on a small level and then a philosophical level. The small level is on day-to-day business operations, I'm the person who has to ultimately the people turn to like make the hard decision. And there's no one who tells me good job or bad job. Yeah, there's some investors in the company who like I could like hop on a call with and have them like audit me, but like even them, there's certain things where there's like no right answer. There's just how do I justify it? Either I have to kind of communicate my rational logic to the team of like, here's why we should spend $5,000 on this consultant versus this consultant. There's like no right answer to these problems. It's all a little bit of like playing a slot machine, but trying to be as transparent and like thoughtful in my process as possible. And kind of waking up every day and looking in the mirror and being like, I have conviction. I can make this decision. This is the right decision. And the more philosophical thing is in college is a place that if you're lucky enough to go to like a really privileged college, like a Stanford where there's tons of money and, support kind of thrown at you, which I'm extremely grateful for. It's a place where you can really flourish because there is such a low activation cost with so much low-hanging fruit reward near you. Like I said, it was like free for me to sign up for any 4-hour slot at this like magical product realization place, and I could like 3D print or like woodwork anything for like free. So you can make a new product like every week with like zero cost. So much harder to like take that leap of faith in your real world, and now you're paying out of your pocket to like ship acrylic to your house and like buy a $300 like 3D printer to put in your studio and paying rent every month and like worrying like the math can get so much more paralyzing. And so I think on just a pure like, does the business model of my life even make sense? You have to have way more conviction in an idea to actually pursue it. And that is a reason why I think so many people who could be great entrepreneurs but just come from like less financially stable backgrounds just are unable to do so for the first few years out of college. And typically they have to work like a job for like a few years and then they have a chance to maybe like drop out and pursue an idea. And that was really tough for me the first couple of years because I chose to go straight into a startup rather than like taking a job for a few years and going into it. So I was like bootstrapping hard and at the same time like learning the realities of how hard raising venture funding actually is. And venture funding can be relatively easy or straightforward for someone in my privileged position as a Stanford grad if you're working on a pure software idea, like you're just building a website or an app or like the next Airbnb. Super easy. You can like raise $1 million from rich people around you with just an idea. You don't have to build anything. But for someone like me who's building a physical consumer electronics product, there's a lot more hurdles. It's a much more difficult kind of business to get off the ground. And so more rich people, I think, are more skeptical to just give you money up front. It's also, yeah. So that's one thing. But the philosophical thing is when you start to work on a startup, it sort of becomes the dominant thing you think about for 14, 15 hours every day. And you sort of like take this one problem. Like I said, we're in love with the problem, not the solution. So the problem is like, how do you create a sense of physical presence over distance for couples and families? And I think about that like 15 hours a day. So you can think about, you analyze that from the business, you analyze that from the product, you analyze that from like, how is the world changing? You're like on Apple's website looking at the new updates to FaceTime, like what have they changed there? You're looking at Clubhouse, you're reading tech articles, it's just so much. Then you're like meeting with other founders who are asking you about it, and you kind of analyze it and you start to go a little bit stir crazy about it because it's like, man, I'm spending so much time thinking about this. And then you start to doubt a little bit. You're like, wow, life is short. As you get older, your friends are getting married, people are being born, people, first couple people in random freak accidents or like cancer or whatever start dying from your like high school graduating class and stuff. And you're like, wow, I'm 25 years old. I'm in the QCC, the quarter century club, as I like to say. And like, wow, time is passing. And you start questioning, like, is this really what I want to be working on if time is scarce in my life? And so constantly playing with this idea of like scarcity, abundance, and having to kind of like hack yourself and then build up even more conviction when you look in the mirror and be like, no, it makes sense for me to be working in tangible for this reason, because it'll make me enough money, but also because it's what I really want to be doing, but also because it's like really important to the world. And so you have to sort of come up with a thesis of like why what you're working on is so important to the world. And that's where I think I've had the most philosophical sort of like loops of disorientation over the past few years. My family is very attuned to climate, and I absolutely see myself transitioning over to climate tech in the future. And I'm already thinking about what are ways I can buy carbon removal credits or have plastic-free packaging for my current companies, that we can already kind of be part of the war against like climate change. And you're always on this kind of endless quest for the absolute truth. And I've had a few advisors, like really old, gray-haired, wise advisors, speak to me as I've been working on my company. And I always ask them, and they always tell me, like, the process of starting a company is you're searching for the truth on something. You're searching the truthful answer to a problem. And I think right now I'm searching for the truth of, like, what is the ultimate way to, like, create that physical presence over distance, but also what is the ultimate truth of, like, how does what I'm working on fit into the greater like truth that humanity is trying to figure out right now. And my latest hypothesis for what the sort of current truth is that I'm trying to like work towards is that if we as humans, at least for a few more years, are still stuck on the earth, and the earth is getting more populated and resources are running out and it's getting warmer, then unless some crazy breakthrough happens and we can all start like jumping over to other planets, like we need to focus on climate change. So that's been something that's taken up more and more of my headspace. But there are certain parameters that can like change that truth. So I think I've been in different cycles of sort of figure out what the ultimate truth is. What does it mean to have a meaningful life? Is that even a question that can be answered? Should that question even be asked? Is that like saying, what color does 2 + 2 equal? How do you think about those sorts of things? So, being a founder is a lot of that energy.
So a lot of the audience that's watching this, including us, obviously, we're students. So we're kind of thinking about, okay, looking at colleges, possible careers. What would be kind of your advice for people in this space who are wanting to make, or maybe are considering product design?
Yeah. Which college you go to is less important than what major you pursue. So that's thought number one. Thought number two is product design is actually a very broad skill set, as I said. It's really just the art of solving problems through low resolution to high resolution prototypes. And there's many different types of product design. There's experience design, there's user research design, there's mechanical engineering, there's industrial design. It goes on and on and on. And I feel like I have such a treasured skill set because right now I'm basically like a kind of I started out as a mechanical designer on Tangible and an industrial designer. I was like, I'm going to be the look and feel guy. Then I transitioned into being more of the user interface designer. So I'm the one who designed the way the app looks. I'm the one who designs the packaging. I'm the one who designs the website branding. And now that I'm a scaled team and an actual company with funding, I'm more of an operations designer. What my design part is I'm designing a mission and a group of people. And so it's not even like I'm designing the product anymore. I'm like designing the team of people who is going to design the product. And that in itself is a fascinating thing. And then I think about 10 or 15 years from now, I'm able to do something totally different. Maybe I can go, design roller coasters at Disneyland, or maybe I can be one of the people like designing a more efficient solar grid, or designing like smart products for the climate tech friendly home of the future. And I feel that too many folks who are like, I want to be a designer, I want to be a mechanical engineer, like their senior year of high school, are already thinking way too narrowly about like what the world needs and the actual horizontal room for exploration within the world of like design meets engineering. So we get a lot of like intern applications every year for Tangible, and we've had 3 or 4 summers of like intern cycles at this point. And I always get a few like 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds reaching out to me, be like, my dream job is to be like an electrical engineer or like a mechanical engineer in the future. I'm like, cool. How many engineers have you spoken to? Forget what type of engineer they are, and be a little bit more open-minded. People don't realize that they actually have the first 3, if not 3.5 years of college to even specialize. And then don't even forget about like master's programs or doing a couple of internships like after you graduate college. You really have like maybe 4 to 6 years more than you actually think to figure out what you truly love doing. There's a really helpful framework that's called like the purpose diagram. I'm not sure if you all have talked about it on previous podcasts, but there's 4 quadrants to it. What you love doing, what you're really good at, what you can get paid for, and what the world needs. And the intersection of all four of those is like your career purpose. If you can figure out the bullseye of like one career, or potentially you take more of a gig approach and do like 3 or 4 different things that cumulatively add to that, I think that's a really helpful framework for a lot of folks to consider. And I've sometimes turned to that when I have a little bit of doubts about that conviction in the mirror. Yeah.
Nice. That's great. Well, as we kind of wrap up here, takeaway for me that I learned from you was just kind of, as we're going into college, maybe keep our options open, don't kind of be narrow-minded with your approach. And yeah, I think a lot of what you said about just kind of your journey as a product designer is super interesting. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things you said is find what you love and do it. Have that conviction. Be very sure that this is what you want, and then pursue it. And like Ben said, broaden that approach, and then figure out what you want to do as you move through college and into life after college.
Yeah. Any last comments you want to add, Akshay, before we end?
Yeah,
this?
maybe looping that out. Life can be prototyped as well, and a lot of people don't realize that. We never really ask ourselves, like, why don't we play life like a game? Imagine if life was actually a video game. We probably wouldn't be on this podcast right now. We'd probably be running around, climbing trees, like hijacking spaceships, like Tom Cruise doing Tom Cruise style stunts, and probably like making as many friends as possible, and doing crazy things, having tons of sensory experiences, and living with climbing almost every single tree that you see just for fun. And the reason why we don't approach life like a game is because in a game, there's usually kind of an overarching set of rules, where if you collect enough coins or if you complete enough quests, you sort of get to the next level. And those levels aren't as standardized or reliable. We don't have that kind of trust with the world. I know it's the same thing of like, if I'm a do-gooder, I go out and do several good things. It's not like, boom, one day, like my body's going to start glittering with stars and like I get like $20,000 in my bank account and like a cool new like jumpsuit or something like that. But just because that's not guaranteed, we spend a lot of our life living in what I would call, or some books call, the comfort zone, which is like just the fear of failure, a lot of this like scared to cross the road, scared to go from 0 to 0.1 on an idea, because we've had a lot of survivalistic like kind of fears conditioned to us as children. But when you grow up, all of a sudden, a lot of the rules that kind of limited you as children of like, oh, you can't go out past this hour at nighttime, or you're not allowed to jump this fence, or, I'm not saying do things that are actually illegal or like harmful to others, but there's a huge area in between where we just often say no to things because we're scared of going past that comfort zone, or we're scared of prototyping, or we're unable to sort of approach life like a game. So the more you can do that and just like tease the limits of like, why am I not actually doing this? Labeling your emotions, thinking like, is it because I'm actually scared? Is it because if my dad was here, they wouldn't approve? Or, the more we can sort of question that and dance and make a cardboard prototype version of a new change in your life, I think that can take us great places.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Akshay. And
my pleasure.
Yeah. All right. See y'all next time.